I married him, not them. The words were written in thick black marker across a sheet of lined paper, taped crookedly to the edge of the dining room table. It was not hidden. It was the first thing anyone would see when they entered the house. The handwriting was steady, the letters traced over twice as if to make sure they were legible in any light. Beside the note, 6 plates had been set neatly in a row, forks aligned, glasses filled halfway with water, bread rolls resting untouched. But only one chair was occupied. She sat there in silence, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The man who stepped through the doorway that night had been on the road for 3 days. He was used to coming home to noise, to arguments over homework, to the slam of doors, to the sound of 5 children competing for attention. Instead, there was nothing. The house that should have been alive was smothered in stillness. His boots pressed against the kitchen tile, and the faint squeak echoed too loud in the quiet. He called out once, then again, but his voice hung in the air with no answer. The dining room smelled faintly of roasted chicken. The skin glistened under the overhead light as if it had just been brushed with butter. The potatoes were lined up in a serving dish, steam still rising as though the meal had been prepared for company. Yet no one reached for it. The air was wrong. Not stale, not abandoned, but frozen in the moment just before a family sits down. A moment that should have lasted seconds but here stretched on endlessly. She did not look at him when he entered. Her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the window, unfocused, as though she was already elsewhere. He followed her gaze, but outside was only the empty driveway and the dim glow of a street lamp. When he finally spoke her name, she turned her head slowly, almost mechanically, and her lips pressed together in a faint curve that was not quite a smile. Then she nodded toward the paper. He reached for it, his hands suddenly heavy. The sentence was short, brutal in its simplicity. I married him, not them. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for help. It was a statement, sharp and deliberate, as final as the silence filling the house. His eyes darted back to her, searching for an explanation, but she offered none. She only lowered her gaze to the table as if the note said everything she wanted to say. Upstairs, the lights were still on. A faint glow leaked from beneath the doors of the children's rooms. He felt his breath catch, a whisper of dread creeping into his chest. He wanted to believe they were sleeping. He wanted to believe that any second the floorboards would creak under the weight of small footsteps, that laughter would tumble down the hallway and shatter the unnatural quiet. But deep down, he knew. The house had already told him the truth. Outside, the neighborhood carried on. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically in the next yard, spraying arcs of water across a patch of grass. The world beyond the walls remained ordinary, unchanged, unaware. Inside, time felt suspended. Every object in the room seemed to wait with him, the ticking clock, the untouched food, the paper note curling slightly at the corner. When the officers arrived minutes later, summoned by a frantic call, they found her still seated at the head of the table. She rose when they asked her to, calmly, without resistance, her movements slow and deliberate. Her expression was unreadable, her voice silent. She walked between them with the same composure as someone leaving a church pew after prayer. Nothing in her face betrayed urgency, guilt, or even relief. Only absence. The first officer who touched the note paused, his eyes flicking to the words again and again, as if trying to decide whether it was confession, defiance, or resignation. He folded it carefully, slid it into an evidence bag, and tucked it away, but the phrase clung to the air long after it was gone. It lingered like a shadow over the table, over the house, over the man who stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the empty chairs where his children should have been. When the father left home, he believed he was leaving his family in safe hands. A second wife who had promised to hold his household together while he worked long hours on the road. But when he returned, those hands were folded neatly on a table set for 6, with only 5 chairs forever empty. This was not a crime of passion. It was not chaos or rage. It was the silence of a woman who had waited too long, the silence of a house where 5 young voices would never rise again. And from that night forward, The sentence written on a sheet of paper would echo louder than any scream. I married him, not them. By daylight, the house on Birchwood Lane looked like any other. A modest single-story home with peeling white paint, a small garden trimmed neatly, and a porch light that flicked on automatically at 7 p.m. every evening. Neighbors knew the woman who lived there as polite and reserved. She was in her early 40s, always dressed modestly, hair pinned back with precision, skirts that reached her calves, blouses buttoned high. On Sundays she walked to church carrying a worn leather Bible. She nodded to those she passed, never lingering long enough for small talk. Her voice was soft, measured, the kind that slipped easily into the background of conversation. To most people she seemed ordinary, perhaps even admirable, a woman who kept her home in order while her husband drove freight across state lines. Her husband was a truck driver, the type of man who waved at the mailman and asked about the weather but rarely stayed around long enough to join in a neighborhood barbecue. He was known as patient, even kind, the kind of man who smiled when people mentioned how many children he had. But behind that smile was exhaustion. He worked long hauls, gone for 3 or 4 days at a time, sometimes a full week. When he was home, he rested, tinkered with his truck, and then left again. The rhythm never changed. The family depended on his wages, and his absence became part of their identity. His wife was left to manage everything else. Neighbors remembered seeing the family together on occasional weekends. A trip to the grocery store, 5 children trailing behind the cart, backpacks slung carelessly, their small arguments echoing through the aisles. She pushed the cart while he walked beside them, a hand resting on the handle for show. To strangers, it looked like a complete family unit. At the checkout line, he reached for his wallet. She stacked the groceries in bags, and the children tugged impatiently at their sleeves. From the outside, it was stable, if not picture perfect. A father who provided, a stepmother who kept the household together, children who were loud but healthy, nothing alarming, nothing to suggest that the foundation was crumbling beneath the surface. The woman's life before this marriage was quieter. She had lived alone for years, working part-time in a fabric shop, known for her steady hand with a sewing needle. She was not wealthy, not remarkable, but dependable. The marriage was seen by many as a chance at companionship, a late partnership that would save her from a life of solitude. Yet with the marriage came 5 children, all from her husband's first wife. The mother of those children was long gone, and her absence was never fully explained. Some whispered she had left the state, others said she struggled with addiction, but the truth never seemed to matter. What mattered was that the children needed care, and the stepmother's vow before God was interpreted as a vow to them as well, whether she spoke it or not. At church, she sat 2 pews from the front, the children lined beside her in their Sunday clothes, pressed and neat. To the congregation, it was proof of her devotion. She bowed her head during prayer, lifted her voice during hymns, and slipped out quietly after service, her hand guiding the smallest child. People admired her restraint, her composure. They called her dutiful, faithful, strong. No one asked how much of that image was built from strain. The cracks showed only in small ways. Her smile was thin, fading quickly once she thought no one was looking. Her steps were stiff, her posture more rigid with each passing month. The children rarely clung to her side, instead scattering the moment they were dismissed from service, leaving her alone in the pew to collect coats and hymnals. One neighbor recalled seeing her stand at the edge of the driveway at 6 a.m., watching the school bus rumble away, her figure lingering long after the bus had turned the corner. She stood there alone until the morning sun grew harsh, then walked back inside with her head bowed. Inside the house, the story was different. Tension clung to every room. The children spoke to her with a careful distance, polite when their father was around but dismissive when he was gone. They called her by her first name, never mother. She corrected them at first but eventually stopped trying. The title was never hers to claim. At night, when her husband returned from long trips, the children swarmed him with excitement, leaving her at the edge of the living room unseen. He told her once that the kids just needed time, that things would settle, that she only had to be patient. But patience stretched into years, and the gap between her and the children did not shrink. It widened. From the outside, the facade remained intact. A tidy lawn, Sunday dresses, grocery trips, the glow of a television behind curtained windows. Yet beneath the surface, the family was not whole. It was divided by unspoken lines, by the quiet knowledge that love was not evenly shared. The stepmother occupied the house like a tenant, keeping it running, cooking, cleaning, managing schedules, yet never being truly part of it. She belonged to the man, but not to his children. And they knew it. She knew it too. On the evening of June 14, a neighbor watering her plants at 8 p.m. saw the woman standing in the doorway, framed by the dim yellow light of the hallway. Her figure looked frozen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if bracing against a storm that had not yet come. She stood there for several minutes, unmoving, until finally retreating back into the dark of the house. The neighbor thought nothing of it at the time. But later, when the silence of that house became all anyone could talk about, that image returned like a shadow that could not be shaken. A woman alone at her threshold, staring out at a world that would never step in. By morning, the house was never quiet. 5 children of different ages spilled into the day with noise that filled every corner. Shoes were scattered in the hallway, mismatched and muddy, sometimes kicked under couches or left in the yard overnight. By 7 a.m. the kitchen was already crowded, cereal boxes open on the counter, milk spilled across the table, voices raised in complaint over who had taken the last piece of toast. The stepmother moved among them like a ghost, wiping spills, bending to tie laces, pouring juice into cups that were knocked over seconds later. Her words were practical commands, not tender, never met with thanks. To them she was not mother, only the woman who kept order when their father was gone. The oldest, 14, argued over everything. He slammed doors, cursed under his breath, and made sure his siblings knew she held no real authority. The younger ones followed his lead, pushing back when told to finish homework, rolling their eyes when she reminded them to set the table. The smallest child, only 4, cried constantly for his father, clinging to her leg not out of affection, but because she was the only one left. Even that clinging felt temporary, a need rather than a bond. She answered with silence, lifting him onto her hip as she stirred pasta or wiped counters, her face blank as though she had learned not to expect love in return. Meals were rituals of absence. Plates clattered against the table, food served in haste. At 6 p.m. the children chewed in silence or spoke only to each other, never to her. Questions went unanswered. Complaints were muttered and ignored. She sat at the head of the table, fork in hand, eating quickly, eyes fixed on her plate. Sometimes she left her food untouched, excusing herself to the kitchen sink where she washed dishes while they were still eating, her back turned so she would not hear their laughter without her. The air was heavy, filled with the sound of chewing and the scrape of chairs, but no warmth. The house itself carried the weight of disarray. Socks balled in corners, crayons snapped in half on the living room floor, juice stains darkening the carpet. She cleaned endlessly, yet the clutter returned faster than she could erase it. Every morning began with laundry piled high, and every night ended with another round of shouting over bedtime. At 9 p.m. she walked the hallway switching off lights, listening to muffled arguments from shared bedrooms, her hand lingering on the doorframe before moving on. The cycle was endless. She folded clothes, packed lunches, woke children at 6 a.m. sharp, walked them to the bus stop with stiff knees and a face that revealed nothing. By 3 p.m. they were home again, dropping bags on the floor, voices rising in a wave that never stopped. When her husband called, the sound of his voice should have been comfort. Instead, it was a reminder of distance. He often rang from a rest stop at 8 p.m. or a truck depot at 11 a.m., his tone casual, his words always the same. He asked about fuel prices, about the weather, then ended with a short reassurance. "Hold on, I'll be back soon." She never told him how the children ignored her. She never said she felt invisible. She said only that everything was fine, the kids were in bed, The house was quiet. The truth was never shared because he never asked. And when the call ended, the silence in the kitchen pressed down harder than the noise ever had. In those moments she felt herself slipping from the role of wife and guardian into something else entirely. She was the one who cooked, who scrubbed stains from school uniforms, who waited for buses and signed forms. But she was not mother, not partner. She began to think of herself as a servant, a caretaker hired without pay, expected to endure without question. She moved through the house with the detachment of someone performing a job, her presence acknowledged only when something went wrong. The children spoke to her as if she were staff, not family, and the man who had promised companionship saw her as reliable, not struggling. The burden grew heavier with each passing month. Small mistakes multiplied. She once left the oven on until midnight, the smell of burning bread waking her with a jolt. She forgot to collect a child from after-school practice, arriving half an hour late to find him waiting on the curb, arms crossed, eyes cold. Her hands trembled when pouring juice, her mind elsewhere. Neighbors noticed her thinning frame, the hollowness under her eyes, but said nothing beyond polite greetings. The congregation at church praised her strength, never asking what it cost. She was praised for enduring, but endurance was slowly eroding her. On a Wednesday morning in early spring, the mailman recalled seeing her stand in the doorway as the children shouted at each other behind her. She held the door open but did not intervene. Her eyes were fixed on the street, unblinking, her lips moving faintly though no words carried. The mailman handed her the envelopes, but she did not take them until he cleared his throat. When she finally reached for them, her hand shook so badly that the letters slipped to the ground. She bent to pick them up slowly, her hair falling forward, her face hidden. He remembered the image clearly because of what she whispered under her breath, a sentence barely audible but sharp enough to chill him even in the morning sun. "They are not mine." The words vanished into the air, unnoticed by the children who continued bickering inside. But for the mailman, it was a phrase that lodged in memory. A phrase that sounded less like a complaint and more like a warning of what was to come. The signs began quietly, small enough to dismiss if you were not looking closely. One evening at 6 p.m. the children sat at the table, waiting for dinner. Plates were set, forks clinked against the wood as restless hands tapped. But the stove was cold, the counters bare. She had forgotten to cook. When the oldest boy asked what they were supposed to eat, her face stayed blank for a long moment, as if she had not heard him. Finally, she opened a cupboard, pulled out boxes of cereal and slid them across the table without a word. They poured it themselves, milk splashing over the rims of the bowls while she stood by the sink, staring out the window into nothing. The laundry began to pile up. At first it was small, a basket left undone, socks unmatched. Then it grew into mountains of clothes stacked in corners, sour with the smell of sweat and damp fabric. School uniforms were pulled from the pile wrinkled, shirts buttoned wrong, shoes scuffed and muddy. Teachers noticed the children arriving less tidy, less prepared. The younger ones wore the same shirt 2 days in a row. Their hair hung uncombed. When asked, the children shrugged. At home she had stopped reminding them, she folded nothing. The chores remained undone. Neighbors began to see her at odd hours. At 11 p.m. one recalled spotting her on the porch steps, knees pulled to her chest, tears running freely down her face. She thought no one was watching. She thought the night kept her hidden. Her shoulders shook under the thin glow of the porch light, but her expression was blank, her eyes fixed on the dark yard. When the neighbor quietly asked if she was all right, she nodded quickly and retreated inside, closing the door with care as though afraid of making a sound. The children noticed too. At school, a teacher remembered the youngest boy, barely 8, mumbling something that stayed with her long after. He said, "She doesn't want us here." His tone was flat, not angry, not even sad, just factual, like repeating something already known. The teacher made a note, considered calling someone, but decided it was nothing more than a child's complaint about discipline. The note never left the drawer. No call was made. Inside the house, the arguments became sharper. She snapped over small things, shouting when juice spilled, raising her voice when the older ones ignored chores. Sometimes her words broke off mid-sentence, her voice cracking into silence. Other times she shouted until her throat gave out, only to fall quiet for hours after, refusing to speak even when asked direct questions. The children learned to read her moods, stepping carefully around her silence, provoking her only when their father was home. His presence was a shield. Without him, the air felt heavier, the tension thick enough to make the walls press inward. When he did return from the road, he saw glimpses but not the whole picture. He noticed the laundry, the cereal for dinner, the arguments, but he dismissed them as ordinary, the kind of conflicts every family endured. He told her to be patient. He told the children to respect her. He told himself it was normal. And then he left again, climbing back into the cab of his truck at dawn, driving away while the house remained behind, steeped in silence and strain. She began talking to herself, folding half-finished piles of clothes. Her lips moved in whispers no one understood. Standing at the stove, she murmured phrases under her breath, shaking her head at invisible voices. The children mocked her at first, laughing quietly at their stepmother muttering to empty rooms. But as the weeks passed, the laughter faded. There was something unsettling in the rhythm of her voice, something that made even the oldest hesitate. They started avoiding her gaze, slipping past her in hallways without a word, treating her like a stranger who had wandered into their home. One night at 2 a.m., the neighbor across the street awoke to the sound of a door creaking. She looked through her curtains and saw the stepmother standing barefoot in the driveway, her nightgown blowing in the breeze. Her head was tilted upward, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She remained there for minutes, staring at the sky, until finally turning back toward the house. The door closed slowly behind her. The neighbor considered calling someone but convinced herself it was harmless. The next morning she chose not to mention it at all. By early summer, the distance inside that house had become impossible to ignore. The children retreated further from her, eating quickly and disappearing into their rooms. She stopped correcting them. She no longer checked homework or asked about school. She walked through the house without speaking, her hands busy but her eyes unfocused. The boundaries between silence and anger blurred, until no one could predict which version of her they would meet. She was unraveling, and though everyone around her sensed something was wrong, no one intervened. To them, it was just another tired stepmother, another family with problems that did not belong to outsiders. One evening, when her husband returned unexpectedly at 9 p.m., he found her standing at the kitchen sink, motionless, water running cold over her hands. The plates in the sink were unwashed, the floor sticky beneath his boots. The children's voices drifted faintly from upstairs, but she remained frozen. When he touched her shoulder, she turned to him slowly, her eyes empty, her lips parting as if to speak. Instead, she lifted her wet hand and pressed it against his chest, leaving a cold print on his shirt. Then she walked past him without a word, disappearing into the darkened hallway. He stood there for a long time, the sound of the faucet still rushing behind him, wondering if what he had seen was simply exhaustion or something far more dangerous. He believed the answer to every crack in the family was endurance. When relatives suggested sending the children to their grandmothers for a while, he shook his head firmly. "They belong here," he said. "This is their home and it's our responsibility." The word "our" was heavy, falling on her shoulders more than his. He left again at dawn, the truck engine coughing to life, the headlights cutting through the street while the house behind him still slept. Each time he pulled away, she stood at the window, watching the red glow of the taillights vanish, knowing that for the next several days the burden would be hers alone. To him, her role was natural. She was the wife, and wives kept the house. When he called from a rest stop at 7 p.m., his questions were brief. "How are they doing? Did the little one eat? Did the oldest behave?" She answered mechanically, leaving out the screaming matches, the slammed doors, the way the children called her that woman when he was gone. He told her she was strong, reminded her that his own mother had done more with less, and promised he would be home by Friday. The call always ended the same, with his reassurance that she was built for this, that she was capable. But what he called capable felt more like invisible. He never asked how she was coping, only if the children had been managed. The children learned quickly that their father would not take her side. The oldest boy, tall for 14, made a point of defying her in front of his siblings. If she told him to finish homework, he smirked. If she asked him to clear the table, he muttered loud enough for the others to hear. "She's not Mom, she's just her." They copied him, repeating the phrase until it became a label. Not Mom, not family, just her. She tried at first to correct them, to raise her voice, to insist on respect. But the words lost weight when their father dismissed the conflicts as childish misbehavior. To him it was just noise, nothing serious. To her it was erosion, slow and constant, scraping at the edges of her sanity. She wanted recognition, even a small sign that her effort mattered. She cooked their meals, cleaned their mess, kept their clothes washed. She stood at the bus stop each morning, ushering them inside when they returned in the afternoon, making sure they had what they needed for school. But they did not say thank you. They did not seek her out when they were afraid. They bypassed her entirely, saving their questions and confessions for the man who came home only every few days. She was the scaffolding of their lives, invisible unless it cracked. At church, the children drifted away from her the moment the service ended. She stood holding their coats, watching as they ran toward friends, calling out to their father if he was there. Sometimes a kind parishioner would pat her hand and praise her patience. "They'll come around," they said. "You're doing such a good job." She nodded politely, but inside the words rang hollow. She no longer believed they would ever come around. Every day the distance grew wider. Every day her presence felt more like an intrusion in a home that was not truly hers. Even in moments meant for rest, she was not spared. At 10 p.m., when she lowered herself into bed, he often spoke about the children in a way that made her feel erased. He recounted their grades, their jokes, their growth, always as if she were an observer, never a participant. She tried to tell him once that the children were hostile, that their disrespect was cutting her down. He placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled in the dark. "They'll love you in time. Be patient. You're their mother now." But the children did not agree. They had already decided. To them she was an outsider sitting at their table, an intruder who cooked their meals and folded their shirts but did not belong in their family. By summer the pattern was locked in place. He left, she endured. They tested, she broke. When he returned, he dismissed. The cycle spun endlessly, each rotation grinding her down further. The house became a stage where she played a role she had never auditioned for, a part that demanded everything and returned nothing. She told herself that one day they might see her differently, that one day the man she married would understand. But as days turned into years, that hope shrank into a whisper she barely believed. She felt herself dissolving into the walls, existing only to fill the space between their lives. On a Sunday evening at 5 p.m., while the children argued over a television remote, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands clasped tight, her knuckles white. The noise around her blurred into static, her body unmoving as chaos swirled. She lifted her eyes toward the hallway where a family portrait hung crooked on the wall. In it, he stood proudly with his 5 children, her figure added at the end of the row, slightly apart. She stared at the gap between them, the subtle space that marked her exclusion. In that image she saw the truth she had refused to name. She was not in the family. She was beside it, tethered but never tied. The children shouted louder, the volume climbing. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms tighter until her fingertips burned. When she opened them again, her gaze did not return to the children. It stayed on that portrait, the frame tilted, the faces smiling without her. The sound of their laughter filled the room, but she did not hear it as laughter anymore. It was noise, endless and suffocating, swallowing the house whole. And as she stared at the portrait, the glass catching the last light of day, one thought began to harden, silent and immovable. The noise had to stop. The change was almost imperceptible at first. A single morning passed without the children racing down the steps, their shouts echoing across the yard as they scrambled for the bus. The neighbor across the street, who usually heard the thud of shoes at 7 a.m., noticed only silence. She told herself they must have left early. But when the pattern repeated the next day, the quiet pressed harder, and unease began to creep into the street. By the third day, the absence was undeniable. No bikes leaned against the porch rail. No backpacks were tossed carelessly by the steps. The curtains that usually hung open in the afternoon were drawn tight. A stillness surrounded the house, not the kind of stillness that suggested peace, but the kind that suggested the air itself was holding its breath. The mailbox filled steadily, envelopes stacked until they stuck out like a tongue in the heat. The postman frowned, hesitating longer than usual at the end of the driveway. He knocked once lightly, then again louder, but no sound stirred from within. Finally, he pushed the letters inside and moved on, his glance lingering uneasily in the rearview mirror as he drove away. At 10 a.m. on Friday, a neighbor walked over carrying a plate of banana bread wrapped in foil. She knocked gently, smiling out of habit though no one saw her face. From inside, faint sound drifted, the low murmur of a television left running. She pressed her ear closer, catching the rhythm of voices, but there was no movement, no footsteps crossing the floor, no child shouting back through the door. She knocked again, louder this time. The television droned on, steady and impersonal, like background noise meant to cover the silence rather than fill it. After several moments, she placed the bread carefully on the porch rail and walked back home, telling herself that maybe they were sleeping, maybe they were occupied. But her chest felt tight, her mind circling around a truth she refused to name. By Saturday, the street was restless. Curtains twitched as people peeked discreetly toward the corner house. The absence of children was no longer a coincidence, no longer something that could be explained away. They should have been seen by now, running across lawns, quarreling in the driveway, trailing behind their stepmother on walks to the store. Instead, nothing. The windows remained closed. The car in the driveway had not moved in a week. A ball sat motionless on the lawn, half hidden in the weeds, exactly where it had been days earlier. Even the family's dog, which sometimes barked at passing cars, had fallen silent. Some neighbors whispered about calling someone, but no one wanted to intrude. They told themselves that families needed privacy, that it wasn't their business. Each person assumed another would act, that someone closer would knock harder, demand answers, step inside. And so the responsibility diffused across the block until no one carried it, and the house remained untouched. That night, at 11 p.m., a woman walking her dog slowed as she passed. She glanced toward the windows, expecting to see the glow of lamps, the flicker of movement behind curtains. Instead, she saw darkness, heavy and absolute. Then, just as she turned away, a faint light blinked on in the dining room. It stayed for less than a minute, pale and still, before vanishing again. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, gripping the leash tightly, waiting for another flicker. None came. Only the sound of her dog tugging impatiently at the collar pulled her onward. She walked quickly after that, refusing to look back, though the weight of the house seemed to press at her shoulders until she turned the corner. By Sunday morning, the banana bread still sat untouched on the porch, the foil sagging, ants gathering in neat dark lines across the surface. The mailbox bulged. Packages leaned against the door, their corners softening in the sun. From the outside, the house seemed almost abandoned. Yet the porch light continued to switch on at 7 p.m., steady as clockwork, as though someone inside still kept time. The neighborhood sank into an uneasy rhythm, torn between suspicion and denial. Children riding their bikes crossed the street to avoid the driveway. Adults lowered their voices when passing, unwilling to let the name of the family rise too loud in conversation. Inside those walls, no one could say for sure what waited. The television still hummed faintly, its volume low, a machine speaking into the void. It was the only sound that escaped, a mechanical heartbeat masking the absence of the living. And as the days lengthened, the silence grew thicker, spilling beyond the property line until the entire street seemed hushed by it, a blanket of quiet that warned without words. The untouched bread, the unopened mail, the light that flicked on and off at precise hours. Each detail was small enough to ignore alone, but together they formed a message impossible to misread. Something inside that house was terribly wrong. When he pulled into the driveway at 6 p.m., the house looked wrong even before he stepped inside. The blinds were drawn though the sun still lingered, the mailbox spilling letters that should have been cleared days ago. His stomach sank as he unlocked the door, calling out the names of his children, expecting the usual chaos of running feet, voices tumbling over each other, the clatter of shoes kicked against the wall. Instead, he was met with silence so deep it felt rehearsed. The first thing he noticed was the floor. The hardwood that was usually scattered with toys, crumbs, and laundry had been scrubbed until it shone, the reflection of the ceiling lamp rippling faintly across its surface. The living room, once a battlefield of blankets and arguments, was arranged as though for a photograph. Cushions perfectly aligned, remote controls stacked, not a trace of the disorder that defined the family's life. The air smelled faintly of bleach, crisp and chemical, layered over the scent of roasted meat that seemed to have cooled hours before. He stepped into the dining room and froze. The table was set for 6. Plates gleamed under the light, knives and forks aligned as if measured. Glasses half filled with water caught the last orange glow of evening through the curtain cracks. At the head of the table sat his wife. Her posture was rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him. Before her sat a plate untouched, the steam long gone. For a moment he thought she might speak, but she only lowered her eyes slightly as though acknowledging his return with silence. He called again for the children, his voice cracking, echoing through the still rooms. No answer. He rushed down the hallway, opening doors one by one. Each bedroom mirrored the last. Beds made with unnatural precision, blankets pulled smooth, pillows aligned. And in each bed lay a child, motionless, their bodies arranged as if tucked in carefully after a long day. Their faces were calm, their clothes clean, their hair brushed. They looked like they were sleeping, but the air around them told another story. The silence was too complete, too final. He backed out of the room, shaking, his voice breaking into a hoarse plea that carried no response. The panic drove him back to the dining room, where she had not moved. She sat like a figure carved in stone, breathing shallow, her eyes empty. On the table in front of her was a single sheet of lined paper, the ink trace dark and deliberate. He stepped toward it, but her hand moved first, resting lightly on the page as if to guard it. When the knock at the door came, sharp and commanding, she did not flinch. Police voices called out as they entered, their shoes thudding against the shining floor. The husband stammered, words tripping over his tongue, pointing down the hallway, gasping for them to look. But she remained still. An officer approached, his eyes flicking from her pale face to the paper beneath her hand. Slowly she lifted her palm, revealing the words written in block letters. "I married him, not them." The phrase was stark, unadorned, and the officer felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read it aloud. The sound of the words hung in the sterile air, heavier than any scream. She did not argue, did not deny, did not explain. She simply folded her hands again, her breathing even, her expression unreadable. The officers moved through the house in silence, their radios crackling faintly, each doorway revealing the same unbearable image of children lying still, as though placed there by someone who knew their habits, their favorite positions, their familiar blankets. Evidence bags filled slowly, photographs snapped with the muted clicks of cameras. Yet the house felt untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. It was too clean, too arranged, every surface carrying the weight of intention. Neighbors gathered outside as the night deepened, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the darkened doorway. They watched as black bags were carried down the steps one by one, each met with muffled sobs, whispered prayers, or stunned silence. The husband collapsed against the hood of his truck, his face buried in his hands, while the woman who had shared his home sat calmly between two officers, her wrists bound but her head unbowed. She did not look at the neighbors. She did not look at her husband. Her gaze remained steady, fixed forward, as if she were walking a path only she could see. The note was sealed carefully in an evidence bag, yet its words still seemed to echo from the dining table, etched into the air. And as she was led out into the night, the last light from the porch bulb caught the silverware still gleaming on the table inside, untouched, waiting for a family dinner that would never come. The story spread faster than the investigators could finish their work. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the first headlines appeared. Stark black letters stretched across television screens. Stepmother found with 5 children dead inside suburban home. The photographs were predictable. The smiling faces of the children lifted from school yearbooks, their ages listed beneath. Alongside them was the mugshot of the woman, her expression flat, her hair tied back neatly, as if she were waiting for a church service rather than facing the weight of murder charges. To the outside world, it was incomprehensible. How could a woman who appeared ordinary, who attended Sunday worship, who was trusted with the daily care of children, become the architect of such silence? Reporters circled the block, pointing cameras at neighbors who shook their heads and repeated the same phrases. She was polite. She kept to herself. She seemed tired but never dangerous. Some spoke of the children's restlessness, of hearing arguments and slammed doors, but all admitted they never thought it could end like this. The absence of warning signs became its own story, repeated endlessly on morning shows and nightly broadcasts. Commentators dissected the case as if it were a puzzle with missing pieces, but the edges of the tragedy were sharper than anyone wanted to admit. The narrative quickly focused on the fragile bonds of a restructured family. The word stepmother carried weight, centuries of stories that painted her as an outsider, never fully accepted. Experts spoke about blended households, about the difficulties of loyalty and love when bloodlines divide. Yet beneath their analysis lay a simpler truth: she was never embraced. The children rejected her, the husband dismissed her struggles, the community praised her patience but offered no relief. She was present, but she was never included. The marriage gave her a husband, but it also gave her 5 reminders that she did not belong. Attention turned to the man himself. A father absent for days at a time, his silence became a form of neglect. He insisted the children remain under his roof, refused to share the burden with grandparents or relatives, and framed her labor as duty. Reporters dug into his routes, his statements, his belief that she was capable of handling everything alone. In the eyes of the public, he was both victim and accomplice, a man who lost his children, but also the one who left them in her care, without seeing how far she was unraveling. Interviews with distant relatives painted a picture of a man blind to the cracks in his own home, a man who mistook survival for stability. Schools came under scrutiny as well. Teachers remembered details now magnified by hindsight. A girl who cried each afternoon when it was time to go home. A boy who fell asleep in class day after day, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Notes in files documented wrinkled clothes, mismatched shoes, lunches forgotten, a pattern of neglect that had been seen but not acted upon. The principal issued a statement about resources stretched thin, about policies requiring proof of harm before escalating. It was the language of bureaucracy, words that protected the institution but offered no comfort to those who asked why no one intervened. The Social Services Department faced the harshest light. Reporters uncovered at least 2 visits in the past year, complaints filed about overcrowding, about the children looking unkempt. Each time the case workers left satisfied. The house was clean enough, the children answered politely, no bruises, no visible signs of violence. The definition of danger was too narrow, measured only in marks on skin or raised voices. Emotional collapse was not on the checklist. Exhaustion was not evidence. And so the files were closed, the notes filed away, and the woman continued to carry a weight that no one measured until it crushed her. The public divided quickly and the debate grew vicious. Some called her a monster in human skin, a cold-blooded murderer who chose silence over life. They pointed to the cleanliness of the scene, the precision with which the children were placed, the note written in deliberate strokes. This was not madness, they said, this was calculation. Others saw something different, a woman abandoned by everyone around her, a woman who reached a breaking point that no one noticed until it was too late. They called her a victim of a system that praises endurance and punishes confession, a victim of a marriage that demanded loyalty but gave nothing back. Television studios filled with voices arguing across split screens. Psychologists spoke of caregiver burnout, sociologists of the collapse of communal responsibility. Parents called into radio shows, some voicing anger, others whispering that they too had felt invisible, too exhausted to continue. The story became a mirror for everyone's unspoken fears, the nightmare of carrying too much alone. But no matter the explanation, 5 small coffins would soon line a church aisle, and no theory could erase that image. By the end of the week, flowers and candles crowded the sidewalk outside the house. Notes written in a child's handwriting leaned against the fence. Teddy bears soaked with rain slumped forward, their plastic eyes staring blankly at the shuttered windows. The house did not respond. Its walls remained closed, its porch light flicked on automatically at 7 p.m., the glow falling on the memorial below. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking too close, yet they glanced sideways at the darkened windows. It was as if the house itself was holding a secret, a truth deeper than the headlines. And as night settled over the block, the only sound was the soft buzz of the bulb above the door, humming into the silence like a faint and endless dirge. The courthouse filled before the doors even opened at 9 a.m. Reporters pressed against the steps, cameras balanced on shoulders, waiting to capture the woman who had turned a quiet suburban street into a national story. When she was led inside, her beige uniform hanging loosely on her frame, there were no cries, no protests, only the synchronized clicking of shutters. She moved slowly, guided by deputies, her face blank. She did not glance at the crowd, did not acknowledge the whispers that followed her through the hallway. She sat at the defense table, hands folded as they had been at the dining table the night she was found, the same posture of stillness that unsettled even those who had come to hate her. The prosecution began with precision. They told the jury that what happened was not sudden, not a moment of madness, but deliberate. They painted a picture of calculation. The house scrubbed clean, the children placed carefully in their beds, the note written in steady hand and displayed in plain sight. Each detail, they said, pointed to intent. They described how she waited, how she planned, how she chose to act while her husband was away. It was, in their words, not the collapse of a fragile mind, but the cold execution of a decision. They repeated the phrase over and over. She knew exactly what she was doing. Witnesses were called, photographs displayed. The jury saw the children's beds, the small hands folded across still chests, the lined paper taped unevenly but prominently. Teachers testified to their exhaustion, their hunger, their quiet dread. Neighbors spoke of the silence that lingered too long. Each piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's claim. This was not neglect or oversight, it was murder by design. By the end of their case, the word monster did not need to be spoken aloud. It hung in the air like a shadow, pressed into the minds of those who listened. The defense countered not with denial but with context. They did not argue that she acted, they argued why. They brought forward medical records, showing her weight loss, her rising blood pressure, her sleepless nights. They called a psychologist who explained caregiver burnout, the slow suffocation of responsibility without support. They showed notes from social services visits, reports of overcrowding and fatigue brushed aside as low risk. They reminded the jury that she had no history of violence, no record of crime. She was, they said, a woman crushed by silence, ignored by her husband, abandoned by the community, and invisible to the system meant to protect families. They told the jury that she was not a monster, but a human being who had been broken and left alone until she snapped. The man sat in the gallery each day, shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the bench before him. He listened as the defense pointed to his absence, to his refusal to send the children elsewhere, to his words that she was capable, strong, built for this. His face tightened, his lips pressed into a line, but he did not speak. When neighbors testified that they saw the strain, that they heard the crying late at night, that they noticed her thinning frame, he bowed his head, as though shrinking from the truth of what he had ignored. He was not on trial, but the silence around him suggested that in another court, another time, perhaps he should have been. After 9 days, the case reached its close. The prosecution stood tall, their voice sharp. This was not about fatigue or sadness, they told the jury. This was about control. This was about a woman who chose to end 5 lives rather than ask for help again. They pointed at her, seated motionless, and told the jurors that she would never show remorse, that she would never admit regret, that her silence was the proof of her coldness. Then the defense stood, their voice softer. They asked the jury to see beyond the photographs, beyond the note, to the years of exhaustion, the absence of support, the burden that no one chose to carry with her. They said that justice should consider not only what she did but what was done to her. When the judge turned to her at the end, asking if she had anything to say, the courtroom held its breath. For the first time in the trial, she lifted her eyes and searched the gallery until they found him, the man she had married. She stared at him, her gaze steady, her voice low but clear. "I said yes to you, not to them." The words cut through the silence like glass. Gasps rippled across the benches. One woman pressed a hand to her mouth, another whispered a prayer. The husband did not move, his eyes locked on hers, his face pale. The sentence echoed in the room, heavier than any testimony, more damning than any evidence. It was confession, accusation, and judgment all in one. Reporters scribbled it down instantly. Within hours, it would be the phrase on every headline, the tagline repeated across the nation. The verdict came quickly. The jury did not deliberate long. Guilty on all counts. 10 minutes later, the judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She folded her hands again as though she were back at her dining table waiting. Deputies rose to lead her out, but she did not resist. She stood, walked calmly between them, her head lifted slightly, her gaze still fixed on the man she had addressed. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of her words lingering. Outside, cameras flashed, anchors repeated the quote again and again, their voices tinged with disbelief. And as the prison van pulled away from the courthouse at 6 p.m., the reflection of the setting sun caught the barred window, casting long shadows across the street. Behind those bars she sat silent, her lips unmoving, but the phrase hung in the air as if she had spoken it again. "I said yes to you, not to them." The house on Birchwood Lane still stands, though no one lives there anymore. Weeds rise tall through cracks in the driveway, curling against the porch steps where children once leapt 2 at a time. The mailbox leans forward, its door rusted open, stuffed with flyers long since faded by rain. Windows are sealed with cardboard, tape peeling at the edges, yet behind them the rooms remain untouched. The curtains never move, the door never opens, but the house does not feel empty. It feels suspended, as though holding its breath, as though waiting for something that will never come. By day it looks like any abandoned property, another suburban ghost swallowed by time. But the neighbors know better. They avoid the sidewalk in front of it, crossing to the other side of the street without a word. Children are told not to play near the yard, and when their bikes roll too close, they pedal faster to escape. No one mows the grass, no one tends the garden, and the wild growth swallows the fence line inch by inch. Still, the porch light comes on every evening at 7 p.m., flickering for a moment before steadying, a mechanical reminder that once someone lived there, once someone kept time inside those walls. At night the stories spread. Some say a light still flickers in the dining room, a brief glow that cuts through the drawn curtains before vanishing again. Others whisper of sounds, faint and metallic, the echo of silverware clinking against porcelain in the kitchen long after midnight. A mail carrier swore once that he heard footsteps on the porch behind him, though when he turned, the door was shut and the steps were empty. These tales drift through the neighborhood like smoke, dismissed by some, believed by others, but all carrying the same weight. The house has not let go. For those who live nearby, the silence of the house is louder than any noise. On summer nights when windows are open, the absence of laughter from that corner of the block presses against them. They remember the years when the air was filled with shouting, crying, the sounds of children spilling into the yard. Now there is nothing, only the hum of cicadas, only the creak of tree branches, only the faint buzz of that porch bulb. The void is unnatural and it keeps people away. The husband no longer visits. After the trial, he sold his truck and left the county. Some say he could not bear to drive past the place where his life had collapsed. Others say he left because the neighbors would not look him in the eye. The memorial of flowers and stuffed animals once piled along the fence rotted slowly, rain soaking the colors into the grass until the city cleared it away. Only the stain of it remains, faint but visible, a patch of earth darker than the rest, as if the ground itself remembers. From time to time, strangers stop to stare. Journalists, students, people drawn by the story they read in headlines years before. They take photographs of the boarded windows, of the leaning mailbox, of the cracked driveway. They never stay long. The air grows colder the closer they step, and most leave with the feeling that someone is still watching from inside, even though the windows are sealed tight. They cannot explain it, but the sensation lingers even after they walk away, a chill they carry home with them. The community has debated what to do. Some argue the house should be demolished, the land cleared to erase the memory. Others say that nothing built there could survive, that the foundation itself is poisoned by what happened, and so nothing is done. The house remains, decaying slowly, its walls heavy with silence. It is not just a building now. It is a scar, a wound in the center of a street that cannot heal. And still, on quiet nights when the wind cuts across the block, neighbors swear they hear more than silence. A faint scrape, a chair pulled across a floor, the murmur of voices that no longer exist. The sound of a table set for 6, the clink of knives and forks, the hum of a light above a dinner that will never be eaten. The house stands as a reminder, its very presence an accusation, its story carried in whispers. I married him, not them. The words were written once on paper, but now they live on the air itself, etched into the memory of everyone who passes. The house has become a wound that will not close, a place where the silence is louder than any scream, and the message taped long ago still haunts the block like an echo that will never fade.